Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Agenda. As promised, this week there is a lot going on in our country, and no better to explain it all to us than Senator Chris Coons. Senator Coons, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kerwin. It's great to be on with you again.
History is going on right now. We have a possible first African-American female being appointed to the Supreme Court. I don't want to say it's a possibility. I want to say that it's going to happen. But my fear is always shenanigans, right? What's going to happen? What's out there that could hinder this? But more than anything, we have the situation that's going on in Ukraine right now. It's scary. Absolutely scary. This is the stories of the Cold War. I've had conversations with my kids talking about the Cold War and what I grew up in, and I said, this is a lot like this. And unfortunately, but fortunately, there's a lot of people in our country that don't know the history and everything that's going on, and maybe you could shed some light on that. But also voting rights, the disappointing actions that's going on with that, and that's where I'd like to start. Okay. As a person of color, as someone that's been dealing with these thoughts and understands the history of the ability to vote in this country, it just seems as though, Senator, we're going in the wrong direction. And it's very frustrating. And I think that I speak for a lot of people in regards to that.
Well, thanks for a chance to be on and to talk to all three of these issues. First, about voting rights. The 1965 Voting Rights Act was the most effective civil rights law of the last century. It guaranteed access to the ballot box, and particularly for Black Americans who, for decades in the South, although they were technically able to vote, had been denied the opportunity to vote through a whole series of maneuvers and tricks, whether it was poll taxes or a grandfather status test, or you had to answer questions like how many jelly beans are in this jar or how many bubbles are there on a bar of soap. For decades, under the Jim Crow South, games were played with access to the ballot box, so that by the middle of the 1960s, there were counties in states like Alabama or Mississippi where 30 or even 40% of the population was Black, but the voters, 1%, 2%. So after decades of successful voter suppression by the segregationists in the South and in many other states, not just in the Deep South, John Lewis, later a congressman from Georgia, led a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge that resulted in a riot, so-called Bloody Sunday, where police clubbed ministers and priests and civil rights activists, and John Lewis himself cracked open his head with a billy club. That was nationally televised, and it led to a moment of confrontation for the country with what was actually being done to prevent people from marching, in that case, to the state capitol to demand the right to vote. President Johnson took advantage of that moment. This was not long after President Kennedy was assassinated, to push through the Voting Rights Act, which had key provisions that both allowed federal lawsuits against racially discriminatory gerrymandering or the drawing of district lines for congressional seats or local seats, but it also included a provision called pre-clearance, which meant that for a group of states that had a long history of voter suppression, they couldn't make changes where and when people could vote, how many polling places, what the precincts were, how they were designed, without going to the Federal Department of Justice and getting clearance in advance. Now, just a few years ago in a Supreme Court case, that pre-clearance provision was wiped out. And for years, for the last 6 years, a number of us have been working to try and fix that problem. We now have a bill in the Senate called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, named for John, that would fix that problem that the Supreme Court case Shelby County created. There's also another problem that's been emerging after the 2020 election, which is changes by state legislatures to roll back some of the ways during the pandemic that states have made it easier to vote, drive-by voting, 24-hour voting, early voting, vote by mail. There's lots of states that are.
But these were effective means.
These were effective means. I'll remind you, in the 2020 election, in the middle of a pandemic, we had the highest voter turnout ever. Both President Trump, former President Trump, and President Biden got a record number of votes ever. No elected president has ever received as many
not phony votes, but actual votes.
Actual votes. And a lot of the justification by Republicans at the state level for their actions are voter fraud. Mm-hmm. The former president alleged that millions of illegals are voting. We investigated that on the Senate Judiciary Committee. There have been investigations at the state and federal level. There
bipartisan action.
Bipartisan investigations, and there is no proof of widespread voter fraud. So the other bill that we just took up and voted on in the Senate recently is called the Freedom to Vote Act. Senator Manchin of West Virginia played a key role in crafting it. He was a former Secretary of State in West Virginia. It has some voter ID provisions and some provisions to push back on the ways in which voter suppression and voter subversion is happening today. Last thing I'll mention, after 2020, President Trump, as you know, never conceded, didn't attend the inauguration, claims the election was stolen. And because of that, state legislatures in a couple of states are replacing nonpartisan independent election commissioners or secretaries of state by giving the power to the state legislature to overturn the results of an election. That's relatively new, and that would also be addressed by the Freedom to Vote Act. We took up both of those bills, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, in the Senate. All 50 Democrats voted to pass those bills. All 50 Republicans voted against. Mm-hmm. We then tried to change the rules of the Senate to allow us to pass those two bills by a 51 vote margin with the vice president. We were unsuccessful on that. 48 of us supported that change. 2 Democratic senators opposed that change. That's a very frustrating development for us, but we took it all the way to that point to make it clear to the American people where we stand. And I want to reinforce that we could not get a single Republican to strengthen the Voting Rights Act. 5 times since 1965, the Voting Rights Act has been reauthorized, every time with a strong bipartisan vote. In 2006, unanimously. So when Joe Biden was in the Senate, in fact, he was on the Judiciary Committee. In fact, he was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He led the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, and every single senator, Republican and Democrat, voted for it.
What's the change, Senator?
The change is this, I think, lie or this story that there is widespread voter fraud, and as a result, we need to roll back access to the ballot. It's been a stunning development, and it's accelerated over the decade, well, now almost 12 years that I've been in the Senate. I was at the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the 50th anniversary in 2015 of the Bloody Sunday March with Congressman Lewis, with John Lewis. And I had in my pocket a copy of the bill that Senator Leahy and I had written that would have restored so-called pre-clearance. And both President Obama and former President Bush spoke. We had Democrats and Republicans, Senate and House. Very positive moment of celebrating the history of the Voting Rights Act. And I kept going to my colleagues with a copy of that bill. Mm-hmm. If you believe in John Lewis, if you believe in voting rights, won't you join us? And we were only able to get one Republican, Senator Murkowski of Alaska, to join us. Mm-hmm. That was a huge change from just 5 years previously.
And it's just on this notion of fraud and disbelief, I guess, that's that the right sees. So I've been a fan of Delaware politics for most of since my 20s, and watching then Senator Biden, now President Biden, and how he addressed the nation. But this week, after this failure of getting this bill through, I've seen the frustration on our president's face. I mean, it's just absolute frustration, and none that I've seen from him before. Mm-hmm. Is this going to change, or is this frustration and setback is something that we should expect more of?
Look, there's no path forward at this point to changing those 2 votes in the Democratic caucus. Mm-hmm. And folks have to choose whether your response is to say, oh, well, I give up and I'm going to go do something else with my time and my energy and my passions, or whether we're going to double down and be more engaged, get more active in politics, and get more engaged in community organizing and in supporting candidates. A friend of mine, Stacey Abrams, is running for governor of Georgia. And a colleague and a friend of mine, Reverend Raphael Warnock, who's a currently serving senator from Georgia, is also on the ballot. Mm-hmm. I'm going to do everything I can to support them and to ensure that they win, because I think that's a critical pivot point for access to the right to vote and for what kind of opportunities there will be for us to move forward. If we end up losing control of the House or the Senate for my party and for the president, it will be more frustrating and more difficult to pass things like Build Back Better or like strengthening the right to vote. If, on the other hand, we're successful in holding them or expanding the margin, things could get easier. I do think our president is frustrated at how long this pandemic has gone on. Mm-hmm. He has provided, the federal government has distributed hundreds of millions of vaccines. 2/3 of all Delawareans are fully vaccinated. 3/4 have had at least one shot. There have been more than 2 million vaccination shots in Delaware so far, and all across the country, more than 500 million. And we had the highest economic growth rate last year that we've had since the 1980s. So unemployment's gone down, employment's gone up, wages have gone up. But there's also been organized resistance. Mm-hmm. Resistance to vaccinations, resistance to masking, resistance to taking public health steps that will get us out of this pandemic. And as a result, we've got folks who are tired, who are frustrated, who are angry. And that division in our families and our communities, our schools and our businesses is bubbling up to Washington, and it's being reflected in division in our capital.
Let's talk about something international before we both start crying. Internationally, the Ukraine. Things are going, it's making me very nervous, right? Mm-hmm. What's keeping me up at night? These are one of the things that's keeping me up at night. Yep. Some people say it's just posturing, right? Is it Putin posturing down there and trying to make change and let him know from a very, not a new president, but President Biden, this is what's going to stand? I don't think that it is. What are your thoughts?
So first, just to place us in the world, Ukraine is a very large country. It's basically the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. So imagine a country 10 times the size of Kansas that's just 1,000 miles of rolling wheat fields. All the way in the east, up against the Black Sea, it's got some heavy industrial areas. The Crimea is a peninsula that's part of Ukraine that was invaded, occupied, and annexed by Putin and Putin's Russia in 2014. Mm-hmm. The very easternmost part of Ukraine, where the population speaks more Russian, is closer to Russia, two provinces called Donetsk and Luhansk. There are Russian-supported separatists who've been fighting since 2014. There have been something like 17,000 Ukrainians killed in that ongoing fight. But the country goes much, much farther west. It borders Poland and Russia and Belarus. Right now, Vladimir Putin's Russia has positioned 125,000 troops, tanks, armored personnel carriers, howitzers, all along the border, northwest, northeast, and in the Black Sea with naval units. They are prepared now to invade at any moment and could overrun Ukraine fairly quickly. Mm-hmm. The United States, under President Biden, delivered more than $600 million in military assistance and equipment last year, and we're delivering $200 million in Stinger missiles, Javelin missiles, ammunition, small arms, resupply just in the last 2 weeks. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. NATO is the treaty organization where we are obligated to come to the defense of any member. But all the countries right along Ukraine's border, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, they are members of NATO. So all of our European allies in NATO are looking very anxiously at what's going to happen here. Putin's principal objective is to prevent Ukraine from ever joining NATO. Right. He's repeatedly said he doesn't think Ukraine's really a country. Mm-hmm. It was part of the Soviet Union. It became independent in 1991. Putin has said the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, think about this, the greatest tragedy in his mind in the 20th century wasn't the Holocaust, wasn't the Second World War, it was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Mm. So he's trying to make a big show and see whether or not we will concede and take NATO membership off the table. President Biden has forcefully engaged. He just spoke to President Zelensky of Ukraine last night for an hour. I'm speaking both to the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor yesterday, today. A group of us, a bipartisan group of senators, is going to introduce tougher sanctions this coming week and hope to get a bill to the president's desk to give him the support to both send more assistance, not U.S. troops, but American equipment and materiel to Ukraine, to reinforce our NATO allies along Ukraine's borders, and to provide for preemptive sanctions that would send a strong deterrent signal to Putin.
We currently have 4 bases that are on high alert right now. Even
Yes.
though we're not sending troops, they are alerted. Sir, are we on a path to war? I mean, that's what it really seems like right now.
We're certainly on a path towards deploying more troops and more equipment to support our NATO allies. Mm-hmm. If an invasion by Russia into Ukraine spills over into NATO, it will be a fundamental challenge to whether or not the United States, under President Biden's leadership, will defend our European allies. Look, Putin's whole objective here is to divide and weaken the United States from our critical Western European allies. He may actually achieve the opposite. He may pull NATO closer together. After the Crimean invasion and occupation, and after the beginning of the war in Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014, our German and French partners were like, let's not be too hard on him. Mm-hmm. Let's take it easy. Let's negotiate. We're in a different place today. In 2016, Putin interfered in our elections directly, mm-hmm. as was proven.
It's absolutely proven.
And did not face severe consequences for that. So for less than the cost of a jet fighter, he destabilized our political environment and directly interfered in a domestic election. That didn't just happen in the United States.
And we're having the ripple effects of it still, right now.
We're still having profound consequences, as we just discussed, mm-hmm. in terms of people's sense of the outcome of the 2020 election and the legitimacy of our democracy. Putin similarly interfered in elections and in domestic affairs in a dozen Central and Western European countries. Mm-hmm. If you go talk to the French or the Germans, the Italians, the Slovaks, the Czechs, certainly all the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they'll all say that Russian interference, both covert and overt, in their politics and their economics has been stunning. Putin is incredibly aggressive. Mm-hmm. He's playing a weak hand very well. He's invested heavily in restoring and modernizing his military, and he will only stop when we stop it.
I'm worried about cost, Senator. Mm-hmm. This is a very expensive activity that we're going at. We're just recovering from COVID as a country. There's a lot of money going out the door, mm-hmm. and a lot of people are thinking, "Why are we so worried about it?" But as you said, it is important. I mean, this is it.
Look, our previous president didn't really see the value in NATO. Mm-hmm. Was actively negative about the European Union as a trade partner and alliance and NATO as a security partner and alliance, and pushed them hard and questioned and challenged them about whether or not they were bearing enough of the cost and the burden of defense. That's a legitimate question that's been raised by several presidents now. Mm-hmm. And our European allies have stepped up and increased more their investment in their security. But I disagree with those who say we should just step back, that we should pull our troops out of Germany, mm-hmm. that we shouldn't have a forward military presence in Europe, and that European security is none of our concern. If Russia is allowed to continue to invade and to bully and to occupy countries on its perimeter, which they are doing, they invaded and have still occupied 2 areas of the country, Georgia. They've invaded and are occupying a piece of the country, Moldova. They have invaded and are occupying pieces of the country, Ukraine. All 3 of these are not NATO members, but they are former Soviet republics. Putin is just pushing and pushing and pushing. I think a Europe that is stable, democratic, free, and aligned with the United States is in our political, our economic, and our security interest.
I would have to agree.
But
I would have to agree.
There are those who disagree, but
right.
I think it is well worth our investment.
Positive note. Shifting gears yet again.
Can we find one?
I think we can here. Supreme Court nominations.
Yes.
Justice Breyer is retiring.
Yes.
And that means President Biden has to appoint a new person to the Supreme Court. And he has promised and is working very hard to ensure that next person is a person of color, mm-hmm. and a female. Mm-hmm. I am, again, worried about the shenanigans. Is this going to happen?
I believe it will. I just talked to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Dick Durbin of Illinois, last night. Look, I've been on the Judiciary Committee now for a dozen years. I participated in the confirmation hearings for now Justices Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. Mm-hmm. And to your point, the shenanigans that were used to block President Obama from filling the seat of Justice Scalia, that seat was held open for a year.
Absolutely.
And Judge Garland of the D.C. Circuit Court was denied even a hearing, even a meeting with most of my colleagues. They kept saying, oh, no, we can't possibly fill this seat. in an election year and held the seat open for 8 or 9 months. Then a vacancy comes up because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg's untimely passing. Just a month before the election, they moved through Amy Coney Barrett,
Right.
the fastest you've ever seen a confirmation happen, and by breaking some of the rules of our committee and the Senate. And it was very upsetting, very tough period for us.
And people tend to forget there are still matters being decided by the court.
Every day.
Without those, I guess, a balance of power in the Supreme Court and ideas, and these issues are still being decided upon.
There is now a strong conservative bent to the Supreme Court. It is 6-3 justices who would self-identify as conservative jurists. And Justice Breyer, who worked for then Senator Biden decades and decades ago on the Judiciary Committee. He was a First Circuit Court of Appeals judge in Boston for several years. He's been on the Supreme Court for 27 years. He's someone who has built consensus on the court. He's been clear about defending reproductive rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association. He's written a number of critical landmark decisions. He's a gracious, generous, smart, and funny man. Folks who didn't get a chance to see some of his remarks at the White House this week, he's well worth watching. I know the president has a short list of qualified potential nominees. I think the top of that list is the D.C. Circuit Judge, Ketanji Jackson Brown, who was just seated last year. 53 senators voted for her. I participated in her confirmation hearings. She grew up in Florida. She's a graduate of both Harvard College, magna cum laude, and Harvard Law School, and was editor of the Harvard Law Review. A very talented, very capable judge and jurist, and I think would be easily confirmable. We will have some challenges procedurally, I suspect, with our Republican colleagues. Mm-hmm. Gone are the days when someone like Justice Sotomayor or Justice Ginsburg would get 90 votes. Mm-hmm. We are no longer just looking at the qualifications. We're looking at the ideology of judicial nominees. But I think if we move with deliberate speed, if we have a nominee announced in the next 2 to 3 weeks, and then we have hearings by March, we should be fine. We should be able to confirm.
In the perfect world, that's what we should suspect.
But obviously, given that it's a 50-50 Senate, we are. It just happened that Senator Brian Schatz from Hawaii, who's young and healthy, got COVID, and that delayed our votes on the voting rights bills by a week, unexpectedly. So any one senator could change the balance of power in the Senate, and that would have dramatic consequences. We've seen what Senator McConnell is willing to do to control the Supreme Court in the past. I would hate to have us go through this confirmation process with him as the majority leader.
And I'm worried about that. We have affirmative action that is going to be discussed in next year, 2023, and whether or not we should take that away. And I want as many, I just want to ensure that we have a balanced Supreme Court when big issues like that are affecting the country are being discussed.
Well, my hope and expectation is that Justice Breyer will be succeeded by a nominee who shares his judicial philosophy. To move the court back towards the center, we would have to replace one of the more conservative justices who were just put on the bench, which will be a challenge for some time.
So what's on your agenda coming up this week?
I'm literally meeting this afternoon with the Attorney General just to talk about gun violence in Wilmington, how we're doing in terms of criminal justice reform in Delaware, and how I could be helpful or supportive both to our community and to law enforcement, Wilmington, Newcastle County, the state. I'm going from here to an announcement of the redevelopment of Woodlawn. We have one of the largest privately held nonprofit affordable rental communities in America.
Really?
Yeah. In the flats along Union Street, there are well over 1,000 affordable rental apartments that were initially built with the Bancroft Trust. Samuel Bancroft was a Wilmingtonian, was a Quaker, and a successful industrialist 120 years ago, left most of his estate to preserving open space along the Brandywine River and the development of affordable housing in the city of Wilmington.
And he was, I guess, pivotal behind the Bancroft School.
Absolutely.
getting that done, which I am a graduate and an alumni of. So I appreciate everything that he has done.
He was decades ahead of his time. There was no federal role in housing when he did this. And Woodlawn Trustees, which carries forward his vision, is announcing a multi-million-dollar redevelopment of affordable rental apartments for seniors in the flats. Rich Priswar, who runs Woodlawn now, was my first chief of staff when I was county executive many, many years ago. And part of what's making this possible is federal funds through HUD, through the American Rescue Plan. So I've had a great week being in Delaware all week, having meetings with our mayor, having meetings with the county executive, with the attorney general, with Congresswoman Blunt Rochester and Senator Carper, and then meeting with a lot of groups. I did a roundtable with youth, and this was most of this is virtual. Most of these are virtual meetings. The Boys and Girls Club up and down the state. We spent an hour last night with youth advocates from all the clubs in the state, just asking me questions.
Great.
So that was enjoyable.
Well, as always, thank you for being a guest on the agenda.
Thank you.
We love it every time you're here. We feel smarter, like we know exactly what's going on. So we appreciate you and all your service that you've done for everyone here in the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great being on with you again.
As always, thank you for watching the agenda, and we look forward to seeing you next week.